welcome to August Learning Cafe. We're so happy to have Beth Smith here with us. And she is the Director of East Tennessee Services for TNSTEP, Tennessee's federally funded Parent Training and Information Center. Beth assists families with special education advocacy in the 34 counties of East Tennessee. Since joining TNSTEP in September 2014, she has served on the Tennessee Department of Education's advisory panel on dyslexia and has spoken at numerous events to educators, medical professionals, and parents on topics concerning children with disabilities in education. Beth's experience as a parent advocate, she has a teenage daughter with Asperger's syndrome, has allowed her to become a skilled individualized education program IEP facilitator who works with families to build collaborative relationships with school personnel. She has a bachelor's of business administration from the University of North Texas and decades of leadership and team building experience working as a manager in distribution, manufacturing, and leading volunteer organizations on local, state, and national levels. And we are thrilled to have you today, Beth. Thank you so much. If you have any questions you would like to ask Beth, please put them in the chat. We will feed them to her as necessary. There is a copy of the slides that are already in the chat, and later we'll be sending out a survey. We would love your feedback. So I will hand it over to Beth now. Thanks.
Great. All right. Thanks for having me, Karen. And Rachel, I appreciate your assistance. And thanks for allowing us today to talk. I really have found in this job in the 7 years I've been doing it that reaching out to the medical professional community is very successful and really helps families connect with STEP because they trust their medical professionals. And I have found that as a really great gateway. So I hope that all of you get information. And if you have any questions, you can always contact me. I do get contacted by doctors and other professionals, and I'm always glad to help. So today we're going to talk a little bit about educational advocacy for children with disabilities. And that's STEP's main focus is, I call it teaching a man to fish. So we like to help families understand it's very overwhelming for them. So our mission is to make them more comfortable with the process of special education advocacy and give them strategies they can use in the meetings. And we have a lot of training and videos and what we call one-page guides. So really quickly, this is an overview slide of kind of what we do. We are federally funded through IDEA, the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, to assist these families. So basically, every state has at least one organization like STEP. We are the only one in Tennessee. So we are a statewide agency, and all our services are absolutely free to families. All of our literature, everything we post, professionals can use it. And if we do professional training, if we have a grant, it's sometimes free. Otherwise, it's extremely low cost. But like I said, our goal is to reach families. So however we do that, my supervisor and I just got back from doing a big training at the state's school resource officers event. It's like 500 school resource officers. And we just recently gotten a grant to help educate school resource officers on communicating and working with special needs kids. So that's kind of a broad overview of what we do. But when it comes to anything about accommodations, eligibility, anything related to special education, we are a great resource. We also work closely with other organizations that have specialties in other areas. And so sometimes families call us and we will make referrals to those agencies. We're not the expert in all things. So we try to connect people with the person that can help them the most, because as you probably all know, navigating special education or a special needs child can be challenging. And many times the parents are stressed with all the medical issues and then all the school issues, and it just is overwhelming for families. So we try to do whatever we can to help them. So today, really quickly, I thought I would just overview IDEA. And a lot of people are very familiar with it, and some people not so much, or what we do and how we help families. And it's always a good idea because sometimes it opens up thoughts about how you can assist the families you work with. So we're going to review basically really quickly the 4 parts of the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act. We're going to talk about how does Tennessee define a child with a disability and what are the 6 principles of IDEA. And then the kid's on that video at the bottom just because I like him and he's really cute. So the Individuals with Disabilities Education Act, it's been around since the 70s. It hasn't been updated since the early 2000s. So we don't see any update. Occasionally they'll update pieces of it, but as a law, it has not been fully updated. So in Tennessee, we have, in our law, our state law says we adopt you IDEA. We're going to follow everything you do because, of course, it's federal law. And in addition, we're going to do these things. And so some of these things that Tennessee does is define pieces that are in the law. For instance, you may be familiar with homebound education. So IDEA says you will offer it, but it doesn't define how schools are going to offer that. So Tennessee says this is how it works. Tennessee law isn't huge because the majority of things they do are federal. So they just have a few things that are explained further on, but that's why every state has a state agency like us to really help families navigate Tennessee specific rules and laws and that. So basically the whole point of the law is to ensure that every child, including children with disabilities, have what's called FAPE, which it's an acronym because in special education, I think that's required, but it means free, appropriate public education. It's FAPE. It is the basis of the law. And it means that every child can be educated to the extent that their peers receive education and that they get special education and related services that are designed to meet their, and we always like to use the word, it is unique needs. And that's what the law says. It's not just academics, is what are the students' unique needs to prepare them for further education, employment, and independent living. So IDEA has 4 parts. So on the screen, you can see A is the law. B is kind of what we're talking about today. It is the special education piece for ages 3 to 21. C is TEIS, where services are brought in. So when a child is born with a disability and birth to 3, they receive a lot of home interaction, a lot of assistance coming to them, being brought to them. It's kind of a shock when they transition to the school system. At about 2.5, they should start that transition. And then at 3, the school system takes over. And that's when parents really get overwhelmed with the meeting and that process and who's on this team and what is my role. And so we do a lot of training. I usually used to before COVID, and we're trying to work on how this is going to work, but I would go to Knoxville a lot and work with the Children's Center and do a lot of education for parents as they transition into the school system and answering their questions. But Part C, like I said, that's TEIS. Part D is what funds us. It's the grant funding, technical assistance, technology, parent training, and information centers. Again, I already talked about what we do. So now we're going to kind of talk about how the law defines a child with a disability. In fact, today I had a parent call me asking about getting their child diagnosed for autism. Who does it? Who can I recommend? And what the parents don't understand a lot of times when we get these calls is that they don't have to have a diagnosis to talk to their school about eligibility for special education. So it's not a criteria to have a medical diagnosis, and nor can a doctor, quote, prescribe an IEP, an individualized education program, an IEP, for a child with a disability. So the school does maintain the right to do those evaluations to determine eligibility. So when we talk about what is eligibility, the federal law defines, lists basically what are the categories of disabilities. And so the list you see on the screen, starting alphabetically with autism and going to the end with visual impairments, is a list. Now, there are a few here that are Tennessee specific. You have developmental delay, functional delay, and intellectually gifted. Not a lot of states have intellectually gifted as a category. And the difference being that gifted students will receive an IEP that will list programs they'll receive, but they don't get the protection of the law. And by that, I mean, if they say got into trouble for something, the law has specific protections built in and mechanisms to kind of help students with disabilities, and that part, they would not receive that part under intellectually gifted. And developmental delay, what I want to make clear to you all about developmental delay is up to a certain age. It's only for kids age 3 to 10. Used to be local, like specific to localities. Pretty much every locality has adopted developmental delay, but sometimes it's overused. And not too terribly long ago, I was working with a family that they were denied eligibility. Their son has an orthopedic impairment, but because of his age being 4 years old, the school only looked at the developmental delay category. When it's open, all categories are open to all children. So even though we have developmental delay for 3 to 10, that's not a limiter. So just because you're 4 doesn't mean you can't have an orthopedic impairment. So I actually had to give the family information, and then I let them pass it on to the school system, and the school system corrected it. And that's the typical process we try to do without us intervening. Every now and then we do reach out to a special education director when we think it's a big systemic issue or something is happening that they may not be aware of. So we do that occasionally. But in this case, the school fixed it. But for instance, if you have a child that does have an autism diagnosis and is clearly going to meet the autism eligibility, that is the appropriate category that Tennessee wants you to use for that child, not developmental delay. Developmental delay is, well, we know the child's behind, they're not catching up with their peers, they've got maybe some speech language concerns. We're just really not sure what's going on, but we know this child needs assistance. That is developmental delay. And anyway, these categories are all defined on the Tennessee website. The Tennessee website to me is a little bit challenging. So what I like to tell families to do is to Google Tennessee Special Education Eligibility. And that will take you to the page about eligibility, each of the definitions of the child with disability. And they're not long. I mean, and a lot of them most of them have a checklist of things that are evaluated, which is really easy for families to look at. So I always encourage them to actually look at the suspected disability that they may have, and to review it and kind of see if they think that's it. So the 6 principles of IDEA are, we talked a little bit about FAPE, that free appropriate public education for all kids, not just typical kids, that they have an appropriate evaluation. And appropriate is not always my favorite word, but the law defines what is appropriate in evaluation and reevaluation, that if they are eligible, they receive an individualized education program, that it is in their least restrictive environment, their LRE, that the school allows parent participation in the decision-making process, and that the parent receives procedural safeguards, because the procedural safeguards are intended for parents, but many times they don't read them. And so we will talk just a little bit about the importance of talking to families about reading those documents. So again, what is free appropriate public education? It means special education and related services that are provided at public expense They're under public supervision, and they're at no cost to parents. And that means that when your child needs something, when there is a discussion about a child needing speech language, it's, if the child needs it, it doesn't matter what it costs to the school, or that it's inconvenient for the school, or if the speech language therapist is out on pregnancy leave. That doesn't negate the school's responsibility to provide those necessary services. And those are determined by the IEP team. So the team looks at what's required. We're going to talk a little bit further about building a good IEP that will determine what a student needs to access education. Again, this isn't just about ABCs and 1, 2, 3s. It's about the child achieving their potential. And so I many times will tell the story of my daughter, and so I will a little further on, because academically she never needed assistance. So I will use her in stories to talk about, to explain that process and how it works. So how exactly does eligibility for special education work? Because there is an actual process. So special education, I like this flow chart because it's easy to look at when we talk about special education. There is a thing called child find, and schools are supposed to like publicize that they're looking for children or families that suspect their child might have a disability and where to call. Child find can be a medical professional. You can say, I suspect that the student may have a disability, and write a letter for the parent that they can submit to the school to request to sign consent. So that's a referral child find, or through a screening. Like in the case of my daughter, she was diagnosed with Asperger's, well, autism now, at age 8 in 3rd grade. And I took it to the school because I had the document, the private screening that I had done. And at that time, the school just, the principal said, thanks. And I was like, that's kind of not where I thought that was going. And I really never thought about special education. And then I learned my rights and requested to sign consent. And that started my process. So again, written referral requests. So a parent we have template letters that they can use, or they can just write an email requesting to sign consent. And in this whole process, the easiest thing to do is STEP has a 1-page guide about eligibility. It's on the front page of our website, TNSTEP.org. Right under the welcome, there's a video. So if you're missing me, you can see me again on that video. You can watch it as much as you want. And then it also has the 1-page guide about this process of eligibility. It also has some scenarios that our staff has commonly seen on the back, and kind of what to do in response to those scenarios. So it's a really helpful guide. So once you make a written request, so not a phone call, not a, hey teacher, I'm concerned. It's the parent writes something to the principal. They write, I just think Johnny's not doing well in school and I'm really concerned. And I think he might need special education. That's all you have to say. Well, the school can do 2 things. They can either have you sign what's called informed consent on the screen. You can sign consent for evaluation, or the school can decline, but they have to decline in writing. Many times parents I've talked to, I've called the principal, I've talked to him, and he says, well, I'm not, let's try giving him some accommodations and all, because I just don't see it. It's not the principal's decision to make. Yes, they can decline to evaluate, but eligibility is determined through evaluation. So you either allow the parent to sign consent, or you decline in writing. So once you sign consent, there is a timeline of 60 calendar days. That's federal law, and Tennessee follows federal law. So it's calendar. So if you sign informed consent on the last day of school, the school has to work on those evaluations during the summer, because it's 60 calendar days. I don't care if it's Christmas falling in there, July 4th, it doesn't matter. They have 60 calendar days to do evaluations. And there's no standard list. Now, like if you suspect autism or you have an autism diagnosis and they think that's what's they're going to test. There are recommended and ones that they want you to do, like occupational therapy, and some of those should be checked. So there are all different evaluations that can be checked. So a parent really has to express, I'm concerned about behavior. Maybe that's an adaptive behavior evaluation. I'm concerned social skills. Johnny can't write. I don't think he can hold a pen very well. So it's talking to the school about parental concerns and what they've seen in the classroom that make up those concerns to determine what they're going to evaluate. And it can be academics too, so they can look at some academic needs too. So then after the 60 days, the calendar days go with evaluation, you meet. So this would be the first time really the parent's going to meet with the potential IEP team, and it's going to be the professionals that perform the evaluations also. And they're going to go over those evaluations, and the parents have the right to a copy of everything that's discussed in the meetings. They get the evaluations, anything that they've signed, they should get copies of. They're going to review those assessments and evaluations, and then they're going to determine if the child has a disability. So here's what we call the two-prong test for eligibility. Is there a disability? So if that's yes, based on the eligibility criteria. So it's not a random thing. Again, I said you can Google Tennessee special education eligibility, and you can look at all the different criterias for those eligibility categories. And so do they meet those? Yes, criterias. So yes. And do they need special education and related services to actually access their education? And if it's yes, so if it's yes, then you have an IEP team meeting. Some schools will go ahead and implement the IEP right at that moment. Some schools will wait and do it. You have 30 days. So they have 30 days to put an IEP into place. So some will reschedule another meeting to actually talk about the IEP and to get the IEP document started. Sometimes if it's no to the second question, they might be able to receive a 504. So a 504 plan is a section of anti-discrimination law, and you can have a 504 forever. So for instance, my daughter graduated high school, her IEP ended. She now has 504 through her Department of Disability at her college. So she gets accommodations at her university. An IEP is much more comprehensive because it includes related services, it includes goals, it is a much more detailed document, but it's an entitlement that ends either when the child graduates from high school with an actual diploma, not a special education diploma or any other standard, but only the general education diploma, or they age out, which it's called 21 inclusive, which basically means the school year in which the child turns 22. So if the child turns 22 at the end of April, they will still get the benefit of that entire school year. And they're not kicked out at 22, it's just they get the full school year. Even if they turn 22 September 1st, they'll still get to keep going that entire school year. So that's when IEPs end. But parents don't have to agree. So if the school says, we don't find your child eligible, they do not have to agree. They have rights. And so in the green section on the screen, it talks about what do you do if you disagree? And it starts, one is the least controversial, I guess you could say, going to the most, which would be a resolution session, which involves a judge and attorneys and all of that. And I mean, even at due process hearing, you're starting with an attorney and possibly at mediation. So we always say, share your concerns. Maybe the evaluation wasn't done at the right time of day for the child, or the setting wasn't appropriate, or maybe they didn't do an evaluation you felt like should have been done and it was just missed from being done. So ask for that, talk about reassessment, further evaluation. In the end, the parent has the right to ask for what's called an independent educational evaluation, which basically means they have the right to say, I don't agree, up to a year. I don't agree with your evaluation and I'm requesting an independent, then the school pays for an independent evaluation that the team must consider again. And that doesn't have to just be for eligibility. It could be an evaluation on reevaluation, or maybe it didn't even impact eligibility. Maybe they did say a special, a speech language and an occupational therapy evaluation, and they found the child eligible with the speech language, but not the OT, but you don't agree that the child doesn't need OT. So you could then just request an independent evaluation on OT. So that's something we explain to parents and we help them understand how to ask for that. But it's very clearly actually outlined in procedural safeguards how parents make that request. But many times just having a conversation with the school can help fix the situation. So now we will talk about what is an appropriate evaluation. Again, appropriate, my favorite word, but in this case, it does apply and the law uses that word. So again, we talked about the parent has to consent. So anytime the school is looking at your child singularly or a child singularly, the parent must sign consent. And that could be, let's say a child like mine has an IEP in place and she has behavior issues, which she did. And we wanted to do a functional behavior assessment. Well, they have to get my consent to single my child out for that evaluation. And she already has the IEP. Or for assistive technology, maybe, and this is true too with my daughter, she needed assistive technology in middle school. So to look at that, to evaluate it, they have to get my consent. If they're doing the 8th grade ACT pre-exam thing that they do on all 8th graders, they just give it. I don't have to sign consent because it's for all kids. And parents don't have to agree to sign consent. That's their choice. But anytime they sign consent, they need to, or sign anything, they need to get a copy of it. And just keep a file. It doesn't have to be pretty. My daughter's was a big stack that I kept, a big, it got tall. I could go back into it and find what I'm looking for, but I had it. And then when she graduated, I burned it. Now just, I felt like burning it. I felt like having a massive IEP bonfire at the end of it all, but I didn't. I actually probably still have it, I'd say. So anyway, again, after you sign that consent, the 60 days starts. You always want to request a copy of evaluation results. Evaluations are used to look at where the child is presently, their present levels of achievement. It can be, achievement in fine motor skills, physical access to the playground. It's about the whole school. How do they access the cafeteria? It's everything about the child. It has to be in their native language. So if it's a Spanish speaking child, it needs to be in Spanish, Arabic, whatever that is. And it can't be what they call culturally non-discriminatory. It cannot discriminate. Reevaluation, again, is the same way, same criteria applies. The law requires every 3 years for reevaluation. I have seen where schools say, we know, like my daughter's name is Lee, we know Lee has autism, we don't need to reevaluate. But many times a child is developing and changing. And so as a parent, you don't have to agree that the school doesn't want to do that 3-year evaluation. So you can say, I don't agree, and then they do it. You can also request that they do evaluation, a full run of evaluation outside of the 3 years. As my daughter was entering high school, she had some math kind of blips and some things going on. We were trying to figure that out. And so I asked for evaluation early before, because it was due into her freshman year of high school. And I said, I'd like to have a clear picture of her entering high school. Can we do it in 8th grade instead, pull it in so we can all as a team set her up for success in high school? And of course, the school agreed and we signed it. We did it early. So it's not like dead set 3 years, but you just have to be smart about it. You also don't want to use that information if it's old. So if, the original evaluation was done when the child was 3, using that criteria when they're 5, it's outdated. So on the IEP, and we're going to talk about that a little further, You don't have to use that original evaluation data. It's good that first year, but then it gets old and it's not a current picture of the child and where they are. So this is what the IEP looks like. I know it's a really small picture, but in Tennessee, every school system uses the same IEP program, Easy IEP. I don't know that Easy is really an appropriate name for it because parents really struggle to understand it, because at a minimum, it turns out to be about a 12-page document and typically into the 20s pages. But the purpose of it, like it says on here, it's designed to meet the child's individual needs. Many times parents call me kind of what's the standard IEP for a child with autism or with a learning disability. And there is no standard because it's not meant to be written that way. It's meant to look at the child with a group of individuals who know the child and can answer questions about what the school services are, the school arrangement, the parents there to know what the student is doing at home or in, what their thoughts are about the process, all of that. The basic thing about the IEP is it's there to establish what they call present levels of educational performance. That's the backbone. See, the front page you're kind of looking at on the screen is the general information about the student, the medical information, the disability category, all of that. Then you get into what's the present level. So the present levels build the IEP. They may be academic, they may be occupational therapy, present levels. Anything can go on that. And again, there's no quote standard list for disabilities. Then those present levels lead to measurable annual goals, because your goal is to improve the present levels because there's a gap there. It also states any special education and related services and supplementary aids that are going to be provided by the public agency, which is the school, to the child. It also explains how much of the school day the child is going to be educated separately from non-disabled children. And it also talks about how they can participate in extracurricular and non-academic activities. It also says how they're going to participate in district assessments and state assessments, what modifications they may need. And again, there's a set list, and the state has a website specific to accommodations and modifications for state mandated tests. But what I always tell parents, if you want that accommodation for a state test, it has to be an accommodation your child uses on a regular basis. If they get separate testing typically every day, then that can be an accommodation for a state test. When the services are going to begin, and the way services begin or an IEP begins is either when the parent agrees and signs the IEP. So if right at the end of the meeting, the parent signs it, which we don't typically recommend. We want you to sign the final IEP, and typically that would be a draft in the meeting. So it's when the parent signs it, allowing it, or in Tennessee on the 15th day. So if you don't sign it, it will go into effect, it will go into effect on the 15th day, unless the parent files due process to stop it. But what I tell parents is when they get hung up on one little piece of the IEP, unless it's a major change, like a placement, like where the child's going to learn, moving them to a different school, something big. If it's something smaller, an IEP is never forever amen. It can change. When my child was in school, we had IEP meetings probably 4 or 5 times a year until she got into high school, and we pretty much went to the annual, maybe biannual. And like I said, she didn't have any academic needs, and that's before I worked for STEP. So I always put that out there. It's not because I worked for STEP, it's before I worked for STEP. So how do we get an IEP that's going to work? So these are kind of the basic keys to developing an appropriate IEP. You want to have high expectations because the goal is to close the achievement gap. I always told my team, what are non-disabled peers doing? And I have high expectations for the team, for me, and for my daughter. And so what we have to achieve those high expectations. looking at effective education. They have to use what they call peer-reviewed practices. It can't just be, well, Miss Betty, the math teacher, has developed this really great learning program for algebra, and we're going to use it. Because Miss Betty's program might be great, but we don't know that it works. So the school has to use approved programs, and the state has a list of those programs, but they don't mandate what each school system uses. For instance, I'm in Greenville. Greenville City Schools uses a different program than Greene County Schools does. And they're both approved, but they just use different programs. So if parents call me asking specifics about that, it's hard to answer because every school system does it differently. And the best way to do that is to engage the professionals at the school system that monitor and work on those particular programs. Because there are experts in each of them at school systems that can answer parent questions. Measurable progress. Measurable progress is a big deal. The Supreme Court, oh gosh, it's probably been 5 years ago, came out with a ruling called Andrew F. It's like Andrew, but with an E, Andrew F, saying that the school must show measurable progress. You can't have the same IEP for a child year after year after year, that's basically illegal, that the school has to believe that the child can make what they call measurable progress. And if they don't, then something needs to change. So that's a really, really important part of making sure that it happens. And goals are the key to making measurable progress. So related services are determined by the IEP team. And you see a picture of a school bus on here and people think, really, that's a related service? Well, it is. And actually in Tennessee, that's a least restrictive environment. So when they're looking at transportation, the school system needs to look at how they could provide support on a general education bus so that the student is with their peers versus out of convenience, putting them on a special education transportation. So that is a part of consideration and it is on the IEP. Then of course, you're looking at the other related services like the nurse and therapy, and that's kind of what you typically think of. We're also going to talk about on this next slide, it's going to list some things that you may not realize are actually related services under IDEA. So under IDEA, here's some interesting ones. Of course, all of the services you think of with physical therapy, occupational therapy, a school nurse, social work, counseling, so they can provide counseling services for some mental health, for social skills. They can also provide parent counseling and training. So when you have a child that may need sign language, the school can actually be, part of the IEP can be that the school teaches the parent sign language. It's really important for parents to utilize the same communication method that their student uses at school. So if it's a specialized, like a specialized communication device that the student uses, then the school is tasked with training the parent on utilizing that at home. If they use picture cards, the school needs to send a set of picture cards home for the parent to use. So it's like to like, and that needs to be added into the IEP. So if you have questions about that, we can always help families understand how you express that to a school and where to put that in the IEP. So then at the very end of the IEP, we talk about where is all of this going to happen. So the IEP has a logical flow to it. We're talking about the student. We have a description of the student. We've got their present levels. We've got their accommodations, their goals. Then we say, where does all this occur? So we're talking about what the student needs, and then we have to look at where it happens. So when you look at this slide, it talks about special education is not a place. And if you look at the kids raising their hand on the left, that is least restrictive environment. That is a classroom, general education classroom. It's in their zoned school first. That's always should be first. Then If you look at the middle picture, it's a smaller group. Okay, so now we've kind of moved the child maybe out of their general education class with their peers into a smaller group learning. So that's more restrictive. Then on the right is a child in need of some medical care who's learning kind of in a hospital basis. So that would be the most restrictive because they're really removed from their peers. So the goal of the federal government is to keep the child in least restrictive. And the state calls it what they call a continuum of placement, which means it's not all or nothing. You're not in a comprehensive development classroom all day. You doesn't have to be like that. The movement can be in and out with support. So it's how can we bring services into the child in the general education classroom first. If that is not possible, then maybe the child has to be brought out for some services. And then it just depends on what it is. But if you read the statement below the pictures, it talks about there's no guarantee of a general education classroom. You have to try that first, see if it's possible, if it can be done, not because the school can't afford it, but can it be done? Do they have the services to do it? And if not, sometimes, you don't want a child just sitting at the back of a general education classroom not learning. It's more important to get them in the proper place to learn. And sometimes that is a segregated setting. It's just that determination, and that is the IEP team's determination. So a parent's role, we always tell parents, you are a team member, and parents are one of the most important team members. There are things that parents can do that no other team members can do. Them and what's called the LEA representative are the two highest ranking members of the IEP team. So the LEA is your local education agency, which is your local school system. So there is a person on the team, and that's typically like a school principal or assistant principal, that can make decisions for the school system. Them and the parent are actually the two highest ranking members of the team. They can dismiss members. They can, if you need the PE teacher to come in to talk about accommodations, but the PE teacher, maybe they don't need to stay for the whole meeting, the parent can allow the PE teacher to leave, or they can say, Mrs. Smith, I really like your input. I really want you to stay for the whole meeting. So the parent then can ask that person to stay. So they really do play a huge role. But procedural safeguards basically are taking the law that pertains to parents' rights, and they're put into one document. And it's not a very exciting document, but it's a really important document about what parents can do if they don't agree with what the school system says, if their child gets in trouble. My daughter, like I said, she had behaviors. There was a time when she was flailing her arms and she accidentally hit a teacher. What is her protection for striking a teacher? And, how does that process work? So it's really, really important for parents to utilize the procedural safeguards. And then tips for parents. This is kind of the tips we always give parents: to read that book, do everything in writing. I have an email file with my daughter's name on it. Always keep copies of everything that you sign, evaluations, IEPs. Always prepare for a meeting. I never went into a meeting without a written piece of paper. Write down the top 4 things, even if it's an annual meeting that you're concerned about, and make sure the team addresses it with a yes, we will do, or no, we will not do. Parent requested doesn't really mean anything. It's what the school will do. And ask questions for clarity. I always wrote at the top of my sheet, who, what, when, where, why, how, because the burden is on the school to answer those questions of how will they do something? Will they allow this? Who is going to provide this service? So if you can't figure that out, ask the school for the answers. And then we have like I said, we have a lot of videos and content on our website, but they can always go to YouTube and type in TNSTEP and it'll pull up. I always encourage every parent to watch our basic rights workshop, which goes over, how do you communicate and kind of sitting through a meeting and how do you plan for a meeting. It's a whole lot more information about what parents can do. And I've got my next is an information contact, and I want to answer a question that was posed to us by email. So she wanted to know if there are specific services for older teens, like are there processes in place to set them up within the school system with vocational rehabilitation, VR, or other options for after high school training and placement in a job if their disability is such that a university or community college is not the best option for them? All really good questions. So you see my contact information on the screen, and you can call me or you can call our 800 number or go to our website, but we have a specialist in the area of transition. So what her question is pertaining to is at 14, that is the transition age in Tennessee. So even if the student is a 7th grader or 8th grader and they're 14, instantly on their IEP that year they would turn 14, a transition page is going to show up. It really applies a little bit more for high school, but it's going to be there. And transition talks about after school. What are they going to do post-secondarily, and what's involved? What does the school need to do? And I will say that not just in our state, but nationally, it's a weakness for schools to properly fill out, to apply the transition page. And so that's why STEP has, his name is Joey Ellis, a transition specialist who knows pretty much everything in Tennessee that we have to offer. But I will say that every person with a disability can sign up for vocational rehabilitation, and the school should bring that person in. Usually it's the last year of school for the student at their annual meeting to get them signed up with vocational rehab. My daughter is in college. She goes to Austin Peay State University, and she is signed up with vocational rehabilitation and receives some services from them. And she is getting a biology degree. So it doesn't matter if you have a disability that's going to be, you're going to be working, or you're going to get training, or you're going to college, or even after college. So she, even when she gets out of college, she can use vocational rehabilitation for services to help her find a job, to assist with retraining. It doesn't matter. And if you're not signed up, it's never too late to sign up with VR. And so you can find it on the state's website. People have trouble, they can contact me, I'll help them. But those are really great questions about
We
post-secondary.
have some more questions, Beth.
Okay.
One, how would these steps differ for children in state custody? I'm thinking that Rose means the IEP process and when you don't have a biological parent, you may have a foster parent or things like that. How do these steps differ with a child in state custody?
That's a really good question. I do actually talk to foster parents. They can contact us and we can help them also. Whoever has educational rights is the person that would sign.
Okay.
We talk to a lot of grandparents, I mean, that's a real unfortunate scenario that's happening right now as grandparents being parents. So whoever has the educational rights is the person that would sign. And that's the person that the school is going to look to have the meeting and to communicate with. But I'm like I said, I help aunts trying to help a nephew. Like if it's anybody asking questions, we'll help them.
Okay. Well, and then that answers her next question. Who would make the request and who would consent? So that answers her next question. And you've answered that. It was whoever has educational custody or rights, or whoever is mandated to take care of that child, correct?
Yes.
Okay. And then there was one, how hard has COVID been on IEP and accommodations for students?
At first, it was a crazy mad scramble because schools were panicked, you know. The state put out a lot of information about compensatory service. So schools had to, and they're still working on it, I think right now, is figure out, did the child regress during COVID? Where is the child in terms of their progression with their peers and where they were when COVID hit? So I think we're still working through it. We still get calls. It's still kind of a work in progress because a lot of schools our parents are just now sending their kids back to school. But there is a lot of guidance from the state and what school systems are doing. And I think schools are doing a little bit better job now that we've kind of been in COVID for a little bit and everybody's getting more used to Zoom and having Zoom meetings. But parents, like I said, I always tell a parent or anybody, if your gut says, that just doesn't sound right, because that's how I started in this whole process, ask us. That's kind of a guiding, you instinctually know that doesn't sound right, that they're doing this with my child or not doing this.
Right. I too had to sit through a couple of IEPs for my daughter in elementary school. And I can remember feeling totally overwhelmed and anxious through the process and wanting to make sure that I didn't feel like we were not getting what we were supposed to get in order to accommodate her. With her, she had orthopedic issues throughout her elementary school experience. So I just felt like I didn't want to be a bulldog, but I also didn't want to be passive,
Yeah,
parents through that process.
I don't think it's such a bad thing to be that parent. Because if you set high expectations going in, that you have a plan going into them. That's why I always have a written plan. Even when I went into my daughter's senior IEP meeting, I had a written plan of questions because it keeps you on track. It shows that you're prepared and you're interested. And if the school knows that about you, they come prepared. They step up their game. And so by the time my daughter got to high school, because I had been that parent, her IEPs were very full because you've just got to always set the expectations. And if a parent goes to an IEP meeting or they have one, for instance, I talked to a parent, I think it was Tuesday, and they had a meeting the next day. Well, I hate to say it's too late for us to it is in a certain, I can help her plan a little bit, but I don't have time to like look at the IEP or dig in a little further because it's tomorrow. But right. I said, the IEP is not forever. Go to the meeting, do these things, call me back, and we can go over what happened at the meeting and then talk about further steps, questions you had, so we can always regroup and go back to the school again.
Yeah, that would have been helpful. I kind of wish they would have said, here, this is what to expect from an IEP, call TNSTEP and they can, but it was all like, okay, this is it. If we hear this. And so it was just a little overwhelming for me. Karen from OmniVision said that she works with a relative caregiver program and they work with aunts, uncles, grandparents, etc., for program assistance other than education. So she has provided that information if anybody has any need for that. And then CASA may attend as well. Is that true? CASA can attend IEPs?
So the parent or the person with educational rights can invite anybody they want to attend a meeting.
Awesome. I didn't know that.
You could bring your sister for support or to take notes. The school has the right to ask who the person is and what their input is and how they know the child. But the parent has the right. And so I do out of courtesy always say to let them know. Occasionally we do attend meetings. If I'm working with a family, they've tried implementing, they're struggling, or they have a disability themselves and I want to model for them how to communicate and all. I always say, but you need to let them know I'm coming. I never want it to be a surprise. It should always be upfront to the school who you're bringing and what their role is going to be.
We do have one more question and we're going to wrap up. Assuming non-public schools do not have to provide special education services, how do you recommend a non-public school respond to a parent's referral request? So I think Walter is meaning private schools or church-funded schools or things
or homeschool. I spoke to a homeschool parent.
Homeschool.
Yep. So a homeschool parent it's what they call parentally placed students. So when a parent places a child in private school, homeschool, any other setting other than a public school, they won't receive a full IEP, but they can receive a service plan through their public school system. So it's actually telling the parent to contact either central office or their zoned public school to determine eligibility. Now, it's not at all going to be as full as what a public school child, it's not going to be everything the student needs. It may be only speech language. It may be some limited occupational therapy services. I mean, it can be very limited based on the funds set aside by the public agency. But I always, like this homeschooled parent, I said, go to your, at this time I told her central office because it's kind of a long convoluted story. But anyway, go to central office to talk to them about the process of reevaluation and what you need to do.
Great. These are great questions. Thank you so much, Beth. I really enjoyed this and I learned so much. Wish I had learned it before, but it's so helpful. If anybody should have any questions, please reach out to Beth Smith. She's provided us graciously with all of her contact information. So thank you for attending. Next month, we will be talking about attention deficit disorder. So we will be presenting on that and getting that information out to you guys. So thank you so much. And we hope to see you next month. Thank you. Bye.